much. Thank you. Um, so my name is Heather Thompson, and I am honored to be here tonight. Thank you. It is lovely to see all of you. Thank you. So as Rich mentioned, I am a facilitator with the DC Peace Team. I'm a restorative justice facilitator, and I have done that for about 4 years now. In my spare time, I am a legal assistant with the Federal Public Defender's Office, and I've been there about 6 years. And I'm also working on a master's in legal studies and a graduate certificate in restorative justice, so that I can continue to work on my passion and help people find ways to forgive and heal restoratively. My story goes back to 1995, April 29th, 1995. My older brother, David, was murdered. He was my big brother, my hero. He was just the coolest person ever. He was completely authentic and lived his life to the fullest. David was openly gay and proud of who he was and lived his life in the same way. And that was one of the reasons why I looked up to him and why he was my hero, because he was just awesome, completely authentic. We had just gotten back from vacation a couple days before, and we were visiting our other brother, George, in Florida for his birthday. We got home on a Wednesday, and Friday, I had called David. I was headed back to school that weekend. I was in college. I was a freshman. And I called David and said, I'm going to come and hang out with you today before I go back up to school. David did hair, and my mom and my sister were already there hanging out with him, getting their hair done, having lunch. And I got busy that day and I ended up not going to see him. But I got a call the next day, that Saturday morning. I got a call from his job, and they told me that he wasn't at work, and asked if I had heard from him. I hadn't heard from him that morning, so I called my sister to ask her if she knew anything, and she told me not to be worried. She said, David's probably sleeping in. He'll get to work soon. And David was notoriously late for work, and his clients loved him, and so they would wait, and there was never any issue, what time he showed up. But about an hour later, job called back again and said he still wasn't there. So at this point, I had a premonition that something was wrong, and I had a gut feeling that something just wasn't right. So I called my sister and I said, I'm going to head over to his apartment to check, just see what's going on. And my sister said that she would meet me there. We got to his apartment, and because David lived in a secure building, we were not allowed upstairs because he wasn't answering his phone. So we went back to his job, which was about 10 minutes away. He still wasn't there. We headed back to his apartment, and my sister persuaded the front desk to let her upstairs to his apartment where maintenance met her. My sister got there before maintenance, and she opened the door, and she could see David on the floor, and he was covered in a blanket, and all she could see was his hand and his foot. So she immediately backed out of the apartment, and she asked for maintenance to call the police. So it took about 30 minutes, but she eventually came back downstairs where I was waiting with my nephew in the car. And the police came, and as soon as the police were there, the ambulance and things like that, I knew he was dead before anybody had said anything. And I immediately felt this rage and this anger and this frustration and just an indescribable amount of just anger. And at the time, again, I was in college and I was studying to be a lawyer, and I really wanted to be a juvenile public defender, and that was my goal. But in that moment, everything was gone. Like, I was just devastated. And so all of my passions to study law and the criminal justice system just was instantly out of the window. And within about an hour or so, my mom showed up. And the first thing my mom said was, "Who killed my son?" And that just led to my anger and my frustration because we didn't have any answers for her. So the next day, the police arrested someone. His name's Brian. He had stolen David's car, and he had shot David execution style. And we came to find out later on that he killed David because he was gay. And so we initially wanted it charged as a hate crime, because it was, why? Like, for so many different reasons, but why? David was a good person and he wanted to help people. And because someone didn't like him because of, his lifestyle was unimaginable to me. Like, I didn't get it, because to me, David was David. And Brian was 18. He had turned 18 about 2 weeks before the murder. And every time I would see him in court, I was mean. I said horrific things to him, things that no one should ever say to anyone. And it came from a place of anger, because I didn't have answers and I didn't know how to move forward. And so he went to trial. He was sentenced to life plus 25. And I felt a sense of peace, and I felt, good about it. And I was like, he deserves the maximum sentence. I'm okay with this. This is good. But the years passed and I just felt like it was weighing on me, and I could just feel it eating at me. And I would take it out. I would take my anger and my frustration out on my coworkers, my friends, my kids. My kids they weren't born when David was killed, but I had them in my early 20s, and I would just take it out on them, just because I didn't know how to deal with my anger. And when I turned 27, I got leukemia, and I was 27, the same age David was when he died. And my mom was in a panic because she didn't want to lose 2 children at 27. So my 28th birthday came around, and it was a hump that my mom got over, and she was able to deal with it. And she was okay with me now being 27. And it was a good thing. But she was still also carrying David's memory around as well. When I turned 29, I went to work for the courthouse, the same courthouse where the trial had happened. And just memories just started flooding back to me. I started interacting with the judges and the state's attorneys who were involved in the case. And Brian was coming up for a hearing. And I said, I'm going to find some closure. I'm good. I can do this. I can forgive him, and I can go into this hearing and I'll be okay. And I went into the hearing and I saw him, and I started crying because everything came back to me. And he turned and he looked at me and he was like, why is she crying? I didn't kill her brother, except he used a slur to describe David. And so every amount of forgiveness and closure was gone. It was out the window. And another couple years went by, and he came back for another hearing, and I saw him again, and I still was like, what are you doing with your life? Like, what's your purpose? You took someone from from my family, and you're not doing anything to better yourself. And it continued to eat at me. And I left the courthouse because I became so jaded with our system, because I could see how the marginalized communities were being treated, how, people of lower socioeconomic status were being treated. And it just wasn't for me anymore. So I moved on and I started working for a bail reform company. And I started to see things from a different perspective. And after about a year, I moved to the Federal Public Defender's Office, and I got to know our clients, and I got to know the work that we were doing. And I started to see how people were treated, and people are harmed, and they are replaying that harm onto other people, but in different ways. And our clients were totally misunderstood. Nobody knew how to help them, because the easiest thing was to punish them and incarcerate them. So after a lot of thought and prayer, I decided I wanted to meet Brian, and that I needed to do this for me. And it had been long enough that I'd been carrying it around. And I reached out to Maryland Department of Corrections, who put me in touch with an amazing facilitator. And Lauren spoke with me and asked me why I wanted to meet Brian. And I told her I really just needed to find some closure. It wasn't out of revenge. It wasn't out of hate. It was just, I wanted to find some closure. And she said, okay, well, let me reach out to him and let me see what he says. And honestly, I thought he was going to say he didn't want to meet me because of what happened 20 years ago in court. And surprisingly, she said he did want to meet. And I was like, okay, I'm ready. Let's do this. And it was November of 2018 when she reached out to him. And January 2019, I drove up to Hagerstown, Maryland, And I was a little nervous. I had only seen, things on TV. I didn't really know what to say, what to do, but Lauren was by my side. My best friend was my support person. And we came into the facility, and I was in one room, and they brought Brian into another room. And Lauren said, "Are you okay with this? At any time we can walk away." And I was like, "Lauren, I just drove an hour and a half up here to Hagerstown. I'm not leaving. Like, we're going to get this done. We're going to do this visit." And it took us a little while to meet because Brian wanted me to sign a confidentiality agreement, and I refused. I found out later he wanted me to sign it because he still has an appeal pending, but we were able to move past it, and we compromised that we would have an open dialogue and we would just see where it goes. He came into the room where I was, and the first thing I did was hug him. And to this day, I'm still not quite sure where that came from or what made me do it, but it was the best feeling. And my mom is Caribbean, and in Caribbean culture, you hug everyone. You treat everyone with respect as you would want to be treated. And so to hug him was just a natural instinct. And he was taken aback, and he kind of jumped, and he said, "I wasn't expecting that." And I said, "Well, neither was I." But I immediately felt this weight being lifted. And I know when people say there's like a weight lifted from their shoulders, it sounds like a cliche, but it was what I felt. And I felt lighter, and I felt calmer, and I felt more relaxed. And in that moment, I realized that the forgiveness wasn't about forgiving him. It was about forgiving me for holding on to something for so long and giving power and control to another person. And yes, Brian may have known that I was still angry and still upset, but to give him the power and the control over my life, he probably had no idea he had that much control. And so I took it back. I took back my power, and this closure and this forgiveness was what I needed to heal. And we sat and we talked for about 90 minutes. And he told me about his life. He told me about his childhood. He told me how when he was 5, his father had a dog attack him. And because of that, he was now terrified of dogs. And in my mind, all I could think was, as a parent, how do you do that to your child? How do you make your child so scared and so afraid? And you've started now this cycle of trauma that is going to be with your child forever. And I just learned so much from him. And I learned how to begin healing, not just for myself, but I could see it in his eyes. I could see that he wanted to talk and that he wanted to open up. And he probably never had that opportunity before. And if he did, maybe not to the extent that we shared. He told me great stories about David. And he told me how David wanted me to meet him and wanted to share stories about, being in college. And Brian at the time was part of Job Corps, and David wanted me to encourage him, and all these things that I didn't know about. And it made me see David, in a different light as well. And it reinforced that David wanted to help people, and he was always there for people. And Brian asked for forgiveness, and I never quite asked what he was asking forgiveness for, but I accepted his forgiveness, and I offered my forgiveness, my apologies, and for how I treated him. And I remember him telling me, "You don't owe me an apology." And I said, "I actually do. You're a human being who deserves respect, and I didn't treat you with respect. And regardless of the harm that was done, you still deserve that respect." And he was gracious enough to accept my apology. And he asked about my mother and my brother and my sister and my kids. And he told me how much he enjoyed math and science. And I promised to send him some books. And we ended our conversation with another hug. And I told him I would be back to see him. And when I left, I called my mom, and my mom told me that it was now my job to take care of him. And my mom said that because, for many reasons, but one, because his family didn't come to visit him, and his family was in DC, so it was hard for them to get to Hagerstown to visit him. So my mom told me that I now have to take care of him. And I went back a few months later to see him. And unfortunately, that visit didn't go as well. And then a few months later, the pandemic happened. So I haven't been able to go back and see him. Visitation is back open at the facility, and I do hope to go back. I haven't quite gotten my courage yet again to go, but I'm looking forward to it when I do go. But forgiveness is something that we talk about a lot. And until that meeting, I always thought forgiveness was just something that we give to other people. And I never really realized sometimes we have to forgive ourselves. And shortly after that second meeting, I joined the DC Peace team, and I did trainings in restorative justice. And I always think about, there's a Bible verse in Matthew, and I always get the verse wrong. I believe it's Matthew 5:23-24. But coming to the altar and asking for forgiveness. And I really thought about that when I met Brian, because 20 years before that, when David had died, I had gotten his Bible. And I remember one day just opening his Bible to a random verse. And that was what I hit on. And during that meeting, I was like, oh, it clicked. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. And it felt right. It felt really good. And I've learned that through restorative justice, people don't have to be punished. People just want to be heard. And people who are hurt other people. And the cycle will continue until we can find ways to heal. But when we put people in jail, it doesn't help, because no one is being rehabilitated. Instead, that trauma just continues over and over again. And after I met with Brian, I learned from his case manager that in the state of Maryland, if you are serving a life sentence, you are not eligible to attend college classes. Your education stops on the GED level. And to me, that was heartbreaking, because if we want to rehabilitate people, we have to give them the opportunity and the means to better themselves. And education for some people is what does it for them. And that kind of, that was hurtful. That broke my heart. And I got to know our clients, and I realized our clients the same. They may be in the federal system, but they're not allowed to do certain programs because they're just not picked or selected for whatever reason, or maybe their facility doesn't have it. And there's just so many different excuses why they can't participate in things. And so I have made it my life mission to become that advocate, not just for the victims, but also for the offenders, because everybody, in a sense, is harmed. And at the DC Peace team, we say harmed people harmed others. And we say heal people heal others. And so it is my motto, and it is how I live my life. And if we can be a restorative community, it'll make the world a much better place. Thank you.